So shooting black and white film is a really great way to get into shooting film and a great way to maintain it because it's really cost effective. It's easy to develop at home and it's relatively easy to scan it at home. In this video I'm going to show you how I scan black and white film at home and what you need to look out for in order to get a good scan. When it comes to what makes up a good black and white image or a good black and white film scan, there are a few things I look for both in the scanning stage and sort of in post-production. Firstly, you want to make sure you have a full range of detail from your shadows to your highlights. So that means that there's detail in all the darker tones of your image and it's not all just black, and there's detail in the lighter tones of your image, so it's not all just white. So with these two rules, I find in black and white photography, they can be interpretive. And there's a lot of instances of images where you deliberately want really graphic elements which are completely black or completely white. For example, in this portrait by Arnold Newman, he's obviously had a very graphic representation of the piano, which is completely black, and then the wall, which is completely white or grey. And they're intentional. So I think if it's intentional, you can break these rules. But in general, it's best to try and get the full range of detail in all the tones. A big mistake is often making sure you have all the tones, but the image turns out very flat, doesn't have enough contrast to engage the viewer or to distinguish different subjects of the image well. But the trick is to maintain a good contrast while not getting rid of any detail. I think with black and white photography as well, not having color to distinguish individual objects or subjects within the frame, you need to control tone very well. So you need to make sure a good rule is that your eye will always lead to the subjects in an image which have the most contrast, and then so the lower contrast areas of the image are going to be seen last. So you want the subject of your image to have a lot of contrast. You can either do that when you're shooting it, especially if you're like in a studio environment, or you can add contrast in post-production. So in the good old days when you'd be printing in the darkroom, you could add contrast selectively. You can also dodge and burn to lighten and darken certain areas of the image, which I have no problem with doing in Photoshop. So without further ado, I'm going to go onto the computer and show you how I scan in black and white. And I'm just going to set the settings that I'm using. So make sure you're on film. And then instead of color negative, we're using a black and white negative, obviously. And so we want our image type, instead of it being a color image, which could result in it having a slight color cast, we want it just to be a grayscale. I'm going to choose 16-bit grayscale. I just prefer to have a bit of extra data with black and white images since they're not as big as color. 2400 DPI, my go-to resolution. Everything else off, and I'm going to hit preview. Okay, so we'll go over to normal, and we've got the 2 frames I've scanned in. Just like with color scanning, I'll do a rough selection and make sure unsharp mask is off. Sometimes it sneakily turns it on, but make sure you don't have that checked. And I'll hit the auto exposure button. Now it's important to make sure that under configuration, continuous auto exposure is off. Otherwise, every time you move the selection, it's going to re-expose. So you can see it's given me quite a contrasty automatic exposure. I'm going to go into levels, and all of this information is being clipped to the left of this arrow. So I'll bring it back, and you'll notice that there's detail in the shadow of his pants. It's just going to come back. And the same for the highlights up here. And all the detail around here in the floor will come back. Much better. And then I'm just going to move out the output sliders. Okay, so we have a much flatter image now. Now what I'm going to do is to move the selection box so that I have the whole frame selected. And I'm going to repeat it with this portrait down here. So have an approximation, bring these arrows out to get all the detail. Bring these out. Now I think that's a bit dark, so I'm going to move the middle point of the levels here to the left to brighten it up. Now we lose contrast as we do that, but we're going to introduce the contrast in Photoshop. Now I'm going to hit all, and I'm going to scan them both in. I'm going to scan them as TIFFs and hit OK. Okay, so I've brought both images into Photoshop. The first thing I'm going to do is to crop this image Now I'm happy with the contrast in the image, but in my mind I have it as more of a high key shot, a lot brighter than it is. So I'll create a curves layer. I'm just going to brighten it. And I'm really happy with how that's looking. Now the only thing is I want to bring out some of the detail in the floor here. This is the Venice skate park, Venice Beach skate park. So I'm going to create a new curves layer, which is just going to operate on this area. Now I'm going to use the hand tool, which I use all the time for creating local contrast. So contrast just in one area. So if you click it, then the point on the curve is going to correlate to whatever you're clicking on. So I want to darken this area. I'll hold down on it and drag down, and it darkens those tones. And to add contrast, I'm going to lighten these areas here. So I'll click on this and drag up, and it's created a distinct contrast in this area particularly. Now obviously it's also affected the rest of the image, so what I'm going to do is to invert the mask. That's Command I, and then I'm just going to brush in the areas that I want. I always convert it back to an RGB, so when you scan a black and white image in Epson Scan, it scans it as a grayscale image. Convert it to RGB, and then you can use all your filters on it. So I'm just going to sharpen it using the Nick Collection output sharpener. Okay, so I'll move on to the other image. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to crop out the borders. Now because of some flare from the sun, which is around here, there's a lot of contrast that's lost, especially on the subject here. So you can see that the contrast on this guy's shorts is fine, but then around here it's low. So what I'm going to do first is to add contrast to the whole image with a curves layer. I'm going to use the hand tool again. I'm going to select somewhere that I think should be darkened and drag down, and then I'm going to lighten it from her jumper. So that's added an approximate contrast to the whole image. And then again, I want to add contrast into this area. So what I'll do is create a new curves layer, and we'll go ahead and we'll add that contrast. Cool, I'm happy with that. And now I just need to mask it off of this area here. So I'm going to hit G to get a gradient, and I'm just going to drag this way, which should mask off the right hand edge, and it has. So you see the contrast dip as I apply the layer. What I might do is to just add a little bit more contrast onto just the figure herself. I really want to make her stand out. Now I'll invert that, and I'll create a radial gradient mask on her. So everything around her is low contrast and she's quite high contrast. Awesome. See how much that makes her stand out. I'm just going to try and reduce the contrast on this side here a little bit more. So I'll create another layer, and I'm going to brighten him up, invert that again, and I'll create another gradient coming in from the side. Cool. Now I think the final thing this image needs is a vignette, where the edges will be darkened ever so slightly. So create another curves layer, and I'm also going to duck the highlights on it as well, but I don't want it to affect her. So what I'm going to do is to copy this mask that we've already made. You can hold Option and click it, and that shows you the mask. Now I'm going to select it and copy it, then click Option, hit Option and click the new layer and paste. So that's pasted that mask. And as you might have been able to notice, it's applied the mask inverted, because we want it to only apply to the edges, not to the center. So if we hit Command I, it's applied that vignette. And so all these curves layers we've added sort of represents a different stage of what you would do when you're printing an image in the darkroom. So you'd start with just a regular exposure with a certain amount of contrast based on your filter that you're using, the grade of your filter. And then you'd start to dodge and burn areas until you have a final image that you're happy with. So I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them for me in the comments, and I'll try to answer them. I'd also love to see any of your black and white images. that you might have used any of these tips to create. So feel free to send them to me or link your Instagrams and I'll have a look. To give you a bit of a teaser for the next thing I have planned, mainly so that I do actually make it and I'm held to it, I've been playing around with ViewScan software, and I'm really interested in it as an alternative to Epson Scan. I've found the results I get very interesting, so I think I'm going to do a bit of a comparison video between the two softwares for color film and show you how they stack up, and it's very interesting, I'll tell you that. But for now, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.